So I'm back with Rose Gottemoeller, now a colleague of mine at Stanford at the Freeman Spogli Institute, but former Deputy Secretary of NATO, former very senior official in the State Department in charge of arms control and other issues. And we are now in the Trump administration.
Right.
We talked the last time before the election had happened, but now we know, how this is
What's
unfolding.
happening?
Yeah,
Kind of.
maybe we know a little bit. So we were, I think, both expecting the worst when Trump was elected in terms of what would happen to Ukraine, that we're both very supportive of.
Yes.
Many of the signals that have been given out up till now have not looked good. The treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office with Vice President Vance was, in my opinion, one of the most disgraceful things I've ever seen an American president do. And it certainly was very insulting to Zelensky. But on the other hand, the president seems to be annoyed at Vladimir Putin at the moment. But maybe you can talk about your assessment of where this negotiation stands right now.
Right. Well, thank you, Frank, for having me back again, and it's good we can continue our conversation. You might recollect the last time we talked, I thought there would be the possibility of a fair and balanced deal for Ukraine because President Trump would not want to be seen as giving in to Putin, giving ground to Putin. And I'm afraid that assessment was simply not correct, that he has leaned more in the direction of Putin and the Russians in this negotiation. They've been getting all the carrots, and the Ukrainians mostly the sticks. So, I'm watching very closely what's happening. Both Zelensky and Putin were very much in a zero-sum position, not giving ground on their demands. And now Zelensky seems reasonable and ready to make some steps in direction of a solution here, but Putin is the one who is still standing on winner-take-all, zero-sum demands. And the President Trump, to his credit, said a couple of weeks ago that he is very, very angry, even pissed off at Putin. And I think that that's a good sign because they really have to begin to get some concessions out of the Russian side because otherwise we're never going to get to any kind of fair deal for Ukraine.
Can you just say, with the minerals deal, this had been a part of Trump's negotiation,
Right.
and that seems to have gone back and forth in terms of how onerous it is for the Ukrainians, and where does that stand now?
Right, and that was at the heart of of that disgraceful scene in the Oval Office that you talked about, because they were going to demand that Zelensky sign this deal. Actually, he seemed ready to sign it going in, but when they started bullying him in the office, and they all basically walked away from each other. So it was a terrible, I think, case study of how not to conduct diplomacy in front of the TV cameras. But after that time, different deals were put on the table, some more onerous, some less. And then the whole negotiation went behind closed doors, which is a good sign, and they seem to be working things out. Zelensky said yesterday, Wednesday, that things are moving in the right direction on this minerals deal. So I don't know where exactly it's going to turn out, but I do hope that it's not, again, demanding so much of the Ukrainians that they don't get what they need out of it, which is funds for their reconstruction. It's a steady state of income flow, and it can't all be going into U.S. coffers by any means.
Yeah. So the real pressure point on Putin would obviously be arms supply to Ukraine. Trump does not seem to be willing. I mean, he may be mad at Putin, but he's not going to go to where Biden was, even in supplying an insufficient flow of weapons. How does that stand right now?
Well, from the very beginning, his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, signaled to the Europeans during his very first trip to NATO ministerial in February, that the U.S. was pulling back from both coordinating and leading the effort to get assistance for Ukraine, but also that Ukraine just could not expect the same degree of military assistance or civilian humanitarian assistance from the United States of America, and that is indeed what has happened. To their credit, the European allies of the United States and partners have stepped forward and have done a great deal to pull together additional funding for Ukrainian military supplies and assistance. And also, I would say just for the bread and butter things that they need, like ammunition. They've done some really clever work on the international marketplace for munitions to make sure that the Ukrainians are getting some of these basic needs taken care of. So I have to say I'm admiring the Europeans for what they've been able to do since the United States stepped back.
In terms of our stepping back, we're still supplying something, but I mean, for example, Patriot missile batteries, we've said they don't get any.
Right. Well, basically, it's hard. It was hard for Biden with regard to Patriot missile batteries because they aren't produced very quickly, and once they're expended, they're expended. So it was, I think, kind of a natural in some ways for the Trump people to take advantage of that difficult supply chain to say, "Hey, sorry, no more Patriot batteries for you." So as a result, the Ukrainians have turned to the Europeans who deploy Patriots and said, "Hey, help us out." That's a very, very difficult demand. What I've noticed lately in the last week or so is that the Europeans are stepping forward with some of their own indigenous missile defense systems and started to offer them to the Ukrainians. So I hope they will be effective. The Ukrainians have their own indigenous capabilities that aren't too bad. So there's something there, but it's not the Patriot, which is the top of the line.
Yeah. And do you have a sense of how the actual battle is going, that the Russians have actually slowed down, it seems, in the last few weeks? I don't think anyone is expecting a sudden collapse of the Ukrainian lines, but do you have any sense of, how the war is going on a tactical, operational level?
Right. Well, the Russians have kept chipping away, and that is clear. And so they've taken a village here and a village there. But I do hear that they are basically finding it necessary to slow down, both because they've taken such a pounding in terms of damage to equipment and mechanized vehicles and that type of thing, but also because they have manpower issues, serious manpower issues that the North Koreans haven't been able to resolve for them. And interestingly, apparently the Russians have started trying to recruit in China and have gotten a few Chinese to come and fight with them, but those are not going to solve their manpower problems, those kinds of steps. So they have slowed down, evidently, but it's not in response to the ceasefire demands that the Trump administration has been making. I think Trump thought a month ago that he had a ceasefire agreed, then this constraint on energy infrastructure, that the two sides would cease hitting each other's energy infrastructure. The Russians have not abided by
there was this terrible attack on Sumy.
Sumy, where 36 people were killed, including 9 children. And so this is a blatant attack on a civilian target. And we see these kinds of attacks happening repeatedly. So the Russians are clearly not in any way abiding by what perhaps Trump thought was a ceasefire.
Yeah. Now, given the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Russians and the Ukrainians, what's the best outcome from Ukraine's standpoint that you could envision at this point?
I think the best outcome for Ukraine is a reliable ceasefire involving the missile duel, the airstrikes that the Russians have been perpetrating against Ukraine. So that would be airstrikes against all targets, not only energy infrastructure, but all infrastructure. Again, as President Trump evidently thought he had agreed with Russia, but no, it wasn't the case. So all infrastructure, certainly humanitarian civilian targets, just a cessation of the air duel and a cessation of any attacks in the Black Sea as well against naval targets. So that would be one good step for the Ukrainians. And the second, of course, would be a ceasefire at the current line of contact between the two combatants.
A ceasefire, nothing close to a peace deal, but just a freezing
ceasefire
of the conflict
to begin with. Yes, I think that's an important first step. And then after that, the haggling will begin. The Russians keep demanding that they need all of those 4 provinces, that they are now Russian territory. This is the Donbass in the eastern part of Ukraine. The Ukrainians, I think they've come to understand that they are not going to get every Russian soldier off every centimeter of Ukrainian land, as Zelensky had been demanding. But I think they want to make sure that the Russian grab of land is minimal from their perspective. So they will look for a ceasefire at the current line of contact and then working on a peace deal out of that, I think.
Now, there was talk for a while of a initial deal over the Black Sea that actually didn't seem that advantageous to the Ukrainians, but what's happened to that?
Well, that was an attempt to return to the so-called grain deal approach, wherein both Russia and Ukraine would get preferential treatment from the insurance companies and from the banking and finance industry that bankrolls food shipments and other kinds of commodity shipments out of the Black Sea in return for ensuring that there were no weapons coming into the Black Sea, inspections on ships coming in, et cetera, et cetera. That deal, which the UN and Turkey helped to negotiate, stumbled and then failed in the summer of 2023. And after that time, the Ukrainians unilaterally, essentially cooperating with their government, made a deal with the insurance companies to give them preferential wartime treatment to continue shipping foodstuffs out of the Black Sea. And they've done very, very well at that. And they've also been denying the Russian sea control in the Black Sea with their own, again, a lot of their own indigenous missile capability. So as a result, I think the Russians have been back-footed a bit. They tried with this deal to return to the same the same points they were seeking before. That is, that their Bank of Agricultural Commerce would get preferential treatment once again, and this time they threw the SWIFT payment system on the table too, and said, you also need to give us free access again to SWIFT payments. And that, I think, was just an egregious sign that they were not serious at all. They were going for broke in terms of sanctions relief, and it just wasn't going to work. So to me, they were dealing in bad faith throughout on this Black Sea deal.
Now, there have been various reports about our cutting off intelligence sharing. There was a report, for example, that one of the reasons that the Ukrainians had to pull out of the Kursk salient that they had occupied was that they weren't getting the kind of intelligence that they'd had earlier in the war. How much of this do you think is reality?
I think there was an episode after the terrible Oval Office meeting when Trump decided that they needed to tighten the screws on Zelensky, and so they halted immediately all military assistance, even in the pipeline already, as well as intelligence sharing. And so that was a very difficult moment for the Ukrainians. It took a lot of pressure, I think, from the Europeans and some pretty clever behind-the-scenes diplomacy to get Zelensky to come forward and say, look, really appreciate your help, Mr. President, really want to work with you on this, let's get back to talking. And at that point, Trump essentially began again with the intelligence sharing, as well as allowing some assistance to flow. So it's clear you have to come on bended knee to Mr. Trump sometimes to make things happen, unfortunately, in my view. But in this case, it did reverse what was a dire decision for Ukraine, and as far as I know, the cooperation's been continuing.
Yeah. By the way, I was at our former employer, RAND, last week and talking to some of their Ukraine experts. I'm not revealing any confident or classified information, but it is just remarkable what the Ukrainians have done, in drone warfare.
Right.
I mean, every brigade has its own drone manufacturer standing behind it, and we're talking about millions a year, and the development cycle is something that Americans could only dream about.
We could learn from them, could we not? And NATO as a whole, I think, really will be looking at the lessons learned from the Ukraine war for a long time. To my mind, now the Ukrainian armed forces are the best prepared and the most modern of any of the armed forces inside the NATO alliance.
Yeah.
So it's just really been remarkable what they've been able to do with their indigenous science and technology and innovation capacity.
Yeah, I mean, apparently, on the front lines, they use a drone, something isn't working quite right, they send a message back to their supplier, and in 2 days, they've already modified the software to make it work better. And
well, they were great missileers all throughout the Cold War. As you know, they built all the big Soviet ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, but also, they are great in terms of their information technology expertise with some really smart young people involved.
They've got a very strong IT sector, and that was true well before the war. Okay, so let's pull back the focus a little bit to NATO as a whole. I thought it was quite remarkable that this European delegation coming to Washington were given burner phones because they no longer had confidence that they wouldn't be spied on by...
This was the European Union. They have good reason to worry.
Although I suspect that every previous president was probably doing something like this, so I'm not sure how new. But it does speak to the level of distrust that is now opened up. From your reading of all of these European, they're still allies, what's your sense of how despairing they are, how serious they are about developing an independent capacity, assuming that the United States really is not going to be there to back them up?
It's a huge, huge lift for the NATO allies because there have been well-known complaints about their free riding on the United States for many years and letting the United States provide the bulk of military capacity and capability overall. They got that message during Trump's first administration. He really gave them a short, sharp shock, demanding that they pay more or the United States would not be fulfilling its commitments to them for defense under Article 5 if they needed it. So they decided to start spending more on defense then, but since that time, they keep hearing that drumbeat, and then at the same time, they're getting a really shocking message from Pete Hegseth and from others that now Asia is the pacing threat for the United States, and that the United States expects Europe to be responsible for their own deterrence and defense, and the United States will be taking its military capacity and moving it to Asia and force structures. So there's concern about troop withdrawals from NATO as well. The problem for the NATO allies is that the United States has provided for many years not only the bulk of military capacity, but also critical, what we call enablers. These are common defense assets that are required for a coherent defense. Things like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. Things like tanking capability to be able to refuel aircraft in flight. Things like large transport aircraft. All of these, and long-range missile capacity, as well as a missile defense capability. We were talking about the Patriots a moment ago. So, there's a lot that the United States has been providing as a general enabler across the alliance in case of war, and now the allies are faced with providing that for themselves. And that is a 10-year at least project, and it's going to be hugely expensive. So that's on top of building up their own individual armed forces across the alliance and spending more on their own defense. Trump is now demanding 5% of GDP. I think all the allies realize they have to come above 2% of GDP. They seem to be talking about the neighborhood of 3 to 3.5%. We'll see where that comes out. There's a summit of NATO in the Netherlands in The Hague this summer, and that will be, I'm sure, front and center. But it's clear that Trump's guys are saying, you spend more on your own defense, and by the way, you pick up all the responsibility for everything that needs to be done to defend Europe conventionally, because we won't do it. Interestingly, they're trying to parse this and say, you do the conventional defense, we will continue to provide for the extended nuclear deterrence. So providing for nuclear weapons in NATO Europe, providing for, of course, the command and control should the terrible day ever arise when they would be needed. It would be the president's decision to launch a nuclear response. So here we come to the problem of reliability, and that's a great crisis of confidence at the moment. A lot of concern about reliability and legitimacy of the United States, and whether they would, and the president would make the decision, if required, to respond to a nuclear attack. Yeah, well, that's not a very dependable partner if it's by no means. And the problem for me is it's very ironic because President Trump says he hates nuclear weapons and he wants to get rid of nuclear weapons, but what he is doing is actually driving an interest in proliferation in Europe. Some of our allies like Germany and Poland have started debating openly whether they should get their own nuclear weapons programs. So
and also Japan and Korea.
Japan and Korea on the Asia side, definitely. So it's, deterrence is all about, it's all in the mind of the beholder, right? So if there's a question about the reliability of the U.S. president and his willingness to make the right decision when the day comes, then that leads, I fear, to more nuclear weapons.
So there is a lot of entanglement. There's a lot of talk lately about the F-35 program because the NATO allies were moving to this next generation fighter and going to standardize on it. And then there's all this suspicions about whether there's a kill switch. And it seems to me you don't need a kill switch. If the United States wants to stop them from using F-35s, they don't need a switch. There's plenty of other ways they can do it. But do you think that program is actually going to survive, or is there an alternative?
Yeah, that concern came up when the United States pulled their support for Ukrainian military assistance to the Ukrainians involving some advanced capabilities, and then this intelligence support, which was deeply integrated, and the United States, as I understand, simply turned off those contacts. And that's where this worry came from, that the U.S. would somehow meddle with the electronics in a way that the F-35 would simply not be usable in combat. And so nowadays, there are those discussions, but I do think that there's been a balancing that's gone on where the United States is the main supplier of defense, advanced defense equipment of all kinds, not only the F-35. Certainly, I'm sure the U.S. defense industries have had something to say in terms of encouraging the Allies to continue and trying to get the Trump people to be a little calmer about this and recognize how beneficial this is for the U.S. economy. So I think there's a bit of a balance going on now, but yes, that anxiety is there, and I think it will inevitably have two effects. One is an effect on purchases made in the United States, but a more beneficial effect, I think, for the Europeans. It will lead them to upgrade, modernize their defense industries, and I hope bring them closer together, because they've got a very atomized defense industry now with, whatever it is, 15 different tanks being produced. They need to have a more coherent defense industry able to work together across national borders.
Yeah. Now, I have to go to Poland next month and give a speech, and obviously the question of the American commitment is going to be formed. Now, as I understand it, within NATO, Poland and the Baltic states and a lot of the Eastern European members were always skeptical about a separate European defense capability of the sort that the French were pushing, because they just thought it was not realistic to separate from the United States.
Right.
But
they wanted to keep the United States in Europe.
Yeah. But now that the United States has told them that they're leaving, it seems to me their position has got to change on that. I mean, do you have a sense of, whether they've now given up on the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it differs quite a bit, and Poland's a good example of a country in Europe that has really reached out to the Trump administration, to President Trump himself, and said, look, bring more troops to Poland. We're ready to deploy them. They've reinforced this idea from the first Trump administration of a Fort Trump in Poland, that they would actually bankroll the construction of the fort, but make sure, Mr. President, your troops are there, your weapon systems, etc. So there is an effort underway among some allies to talking about charm offensives to charm the president and to see if they can actually lock down U.S. capacity and capability in Europe. And I think it will be possible. My view is that the United States is not going to zero out force structure in Europe, nor is it going to remove all pre-positioned stocks that we've done a lot to build up in recent years since the first Russian aggression against Ukraine in 2014. Seizure of Crimea, the United States has built up infrastructure for pre-positioning and actually pre-positioned quite a bit of equipment and stocks in Europe. So I don't see that all going away. But it will take, I think, a willingness to work with the Trump administration and to try to make the case to them, as the polls have done, and not, turning backs on Washington and saying we can't work with this guy. So there's a lot of balancing going on in Europe. I note the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, is in Washington today, and she's a fine example of a European leader walking a balancing act, trying to help the European Union to get a trade deal with the Trump administration, but also having to convince Trump that she and Italy are serious about defense, because they're one of the laggards in terms of defense expenditure.
Yeah. So this whole line that you mentioned of Hegseth, that the United States is really going to focus on Asia, seems to me also kind of a mirage, because you can see the strategic logic behind something like that, but the idea that Donald Trump would actually risk going to war with China in order to defend Taiwan, I just don't see this happening. And so it seems more like an excuse for not helping Europe rather than a serious effort to reposition the United States for a real, potential military conflict in Asia.
Well, there are a couple of points to make here. First of all, I really do think there is, and I will put it this way, a deep loathing of the European allies among some of the top figures in the Trump administration.
Yeah, you could see that with J.D. Vance, yeah.
And we saw that with the so-called Signalgate, when J.D. Vance, Hegseth were quoted as saying, to each other how much they loathe the European NATO allies. I don't know where that loathing came from, but it is, something that they have expressed, and I know that's very concerning to the Europeans because they have been doing their best really to build things up in their armed forces and to spend more on defense and do everything Mr. Trump asked for in his first term in office. So anyway, we'll see how this goes. But the other thing is there seem to be a couple different points of view in what I think of as Trump world with regard to Asia. There are those, as expressed by Hegseth, who are saying, all pivot to Asia, fast forward. We're getting, basically our troops, our reserves, our reinforcements to Asia, and all resources will be devoted there because that is now the pacing threat. And we're going to defend Taiwan. But I think the president himself, I'm more in line with your thinking on that, Frank. What he would like is a big, good, shiny trade deal and maybe a nuclear deal with China. But he doesn't really care about Taiwan. So I think there are different views inside the administration, and it will be interesting to see whether the president's approach is the one that in the end takes precedence.
Also, I just don't think he wants to get drawn into a foreign conflict, certainly a large-scale one, as conflict with China. It was very interesting in the reporting now on Iran, where the Israelis were all set to go to attack, and it would have required a lot of American support. And Trump, who has been, Israel's biggest supporter, basically pulled back from that because he also doesn't want to get drawn in. And so I just don't think he wants to, he wants to have his military parade on the 4th of July, but he doesn't actually want to use those weapons anywhere if he can avoid it.
Well, that runs against his promise to his base, right? No more foreign wars, make America great again. We're going to concentrate on your needs here in the United States. We're not going to send your children to war anymore. So, yeah, definitely I can see that logic in the Oval Office.
Yeah. And that means that, the Taiwanese ought to really start worrying, because I really don't think that, I was never convinced that the Biden administration would have fulfilled its promise to defend them, because I just don't know that consensus is there among the American people. But with Trump and his aversion to actually using the military, I fail to see how that's going to materialize in the future.
Right. It does represent a difficult conundrum for our Department of Defense. What are they putting their time and effort and placing their priorities on now? Is it China as the pacing threat, or does it continue to be the agenda of threats around the world, including an aggressive Russia facing Europe? How do they play that inside the administration? It's a difficult challenge.
Okay, Rose. Well, trade policy is up in the air at the moment. We don't. I think all the people with money to invest are holding back because they just don't know what's going to happen. And I would say investments in defense are similarly on hold because we actually don't know where the United States is serious and where it's not.
And the credit markets are in chaos right now, so it's difficult to figure out how you're going to finance your big deal.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, Rose, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This is an ongoing conversation. Things change, from day to day, and so whatever we said today may be completely invalidated by, a week from now. But we'll keep trying.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Frank. Thank you.
All right, thank you.